This video introduces complex conditionals. Complex conditionals are formulas like the two you see here, where we have one conditional embedded inside of another conditional. These are among the trickiest things that we deal with in propositional logic symbolization, but I think the way to tackle this is to come to understand the meaning of these two formulas. And I think the way to think of them is as different ways of getting to R. Notice that both formulas end in R, and both of these formulas are different routes or ways of getting to R. Let's start with this one. This says if P is the case, then if Q is the case, then you'll get R. It turns out that this is just a fancy way of saying if P and Q are both the case, then you get R. These two formulas are logically equivalent, and when you want to understand the first, it's really best if you think in terms of the second. In fact, when it comes to working with these two formulas, I'm going to suggest that you associate particular sentences with them that explain what they mean. And so for this first one, I suggest that in either form, you think of it as saying if P and Q are actually the case, then R. Well, what does this one mean? Notice in order to get to R here, you have to have a relationship between P and Q. It has to be such that if P then Q, then you get R. And I think when you're looking at this formula, the best way to understand it is it says if P causes Q, then you get R. Read this first arrow as causes to help your intuitions. Now, to be perfectly honest, the arrow in propositional logic really doesn't have anything to do with actual causation. But to understand this sentence and train your intuitions in the right way, I think that's a good way to think about it. Now, another point before we go below and do some examples here, and that is that if these two formulas are equivalent to each other, well then there's two other things that are equivalent. We know that the ampersand is commutative, so it shouldn't be any surprise that Q ampersand P arrow R is also equivalent to both of these. But then thinking back to the one above, it also means that the order Q arrow P arrow R is acceptable. When you say if then in English, it oftentimes implies a temporal sequence, but arrows do not imply a temporal sequence. And so whether you have P arrow Q arrow R or Q arrow P arrow R, you have the same final consequent, and that's what's important. So all four of these formulas are equivalent to each other. All right, now let's say you're going to tackle some sentences, and you recognize that you're going to have multiple arrows. There's a two-step strategy that I'm going to invite you to think about, and here it is. Let's use this strategy as we tackle this next sentence, as we tackle this first sentence. All right, get the pencil back. Okay, this says if you plant the seeds, they'll grow if you water them. If I reduce this to the important stuff, which are the logical words, the capital letters, and the punctuation, I get the following. If P, G, if W. Well, notice when I write that, I see that I have two synonyms for if here, two actual ifs, and I've got three components. Whenever you have that situation, you know that you're thinking in terms of these forms. When you know you're doing that, I suggest you adopt this two-step process. And first of all, you ask yourself, what's the R part of the sentence? The R part is the final consequent. What is the R part of this sentence? If you plant the seeds, they'll grow if you water them. Do you recognize that in thinking intuitively, it is the growing which is the final result that the sentence is referring to? So the growing is the R part, the final consequent. G is going to come last. Now, you can do this intuitively, but notice in this particular example, the P and the W both have ifs in front of them, well, that's a good indication that they can't come last. What follows if has to be an antecedent, and so the sentence is superficially giving it away that G comes last. Now, if you know what comes last, it turns out that it's rare that you need to change the order of the other two components. And so I'm going to suggest that we try P arrow W arrow G, and I'm going to suggest that we write it twice, and then we try reading it in both of these forms, which means let's put the parentheses around the front and also around the back. And now we're doing step 2, and we're going to ask ourselves intuitively, what does the sentence tell us gets us to R? If we read this formula, the trick is to read the first arrow as causes. So we would read this as saying, if planting the seeds causes you to water them, then they will grow. Now that might not be nonsense, but is this sentence saying that planting needs to cause watering? Well, let's read it the other way. And of course, when you're going to read this formula, the best thing to do is to translate it into the ampersand version. The ampersand version of this sentence would say P ampersand W arrow G. And in English, that just says, if you plant the seeds and you water them, then they'll grow. Well, notice that makes so much sense. Intuitively, we can see that, yes, that's what this sentence is saying. And so it turns out that both of these symbolizations are 100% correct. Now, to be thorough here, let's point out that it would also be okay to say, if you water them and you plant them, excuse me, that should be a P, then they will grow. Or even, if you water them, then if you plant them, then they will grow. Now notice your intuitions might balk at this and say, well, wait, you can't water them first and then plant them. But remember, the arrows don't have anything to do with temporal order. And so from the perspective of logic, all 4 of these formulas are equivalent, and they're all correct symbolizations of this sentence. This one is not. So you see that you have this situation because we have 2 ifs and 3 parts. You identify the R part, and then check it against both patterns and use your intuitions to see which is correct. Let's try the next example. If I start by rewriting it, I know that provided that means if. Now notice provided that is followed by the word when. That's another synonym for if. So this is really saying if S, W, comma, F. This looks a little peculiar. If S, W, F. Now notice it will probably help if we put in some implied thens. There's one right there, and then this comma is another implied then. What this sentence is really saying is if S then W, then F. Now, maybe you're seeing immediately what's going on in this case, but I would suggest that what you recognize is, oh, we have 2 synonyms for if here, and we've got 3 parts. That means we're playing the game of making this distinction. So, can we identify the R part of the sentence? And here it's good to read the sentence back to yourself and say, well, what is the final consequent or result of the entire sentence? Provided that when students study, they do well, the class is fair. It would be great if I could honestly say that, well, isn't it just obvious that being fair is the final consequent? It is in this case. I don't think it's trivial to recognize that. I suspect what you have to do is practice this to get good at it. And also, you just have to try something and see if it makes sense. Getting good at symbolization involves a lot of writing some symbols down, reading them back to yourself to see if they intuitively make sense. And so it's this back and forth process using rules and intuitions. But it turns out that F is the final consequent. Notice, I guess what I should emphasize is it's In the previous sentence, the final consequent was given away by the fact that both P and W had ifs in front of them. In this case, it's not nearly so obvious. You might say, well, okay, S obviously can't be the final consequent, but should it be W or should it be F? And in this case, it's F, but again, it's not trivial to see that. Okay, so I put in the F, and now I'm going to write it in the two possible ways here so that I can read this back to myself and see which sounds better. With the arrow in the front, with the parentheses in the front, I know I want to read the first arrow as causes. So this would say, if students studying causes them to do well, then the class is fair. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If there's a causal relationship between studying and doing well, that's the indication that the class is fair. What does this one say? Well, let's check it. This would say S ampersand W, arrow F. Translate it into the equivalent version to help your intuitions. This would say, if students study and they do well, then the class is fair. Now here's another bit of bad news. Notice that sounded perfectly reasonable as well. If students study and they do well, then the class is fair. If students studying causes them to do well, then the class is fair. In conversation, we oftentimes wouldn't notice a difference between these two formulas and the two sentences that I just stated. Here's the value and the reason that I emphasize actually the case up here in as you're reading of the P and Q sentence. Because notice, this really is implying a relationship between S and W. But here what we're saying is that if students are actually studying and they're actually doing well. We have a bad habit that when we hear the word and, we can kind of think of it as meaning an arrow. But if we take this literally as what it says, this is really saying if students actually do study and they actually do well, then the class is fair. But the sentence isn't requiring that both of those things actually be the case. It's saying if there's a relationship between them, then the class is fair. I know this isn't trivial. This is the correct symbolization in this case, and you want to practice this and try to make the basic distinction between these two forms by looking at a bunch of sentences and sort of training your intuitions. All right, well, we've done these two examples. Let me do some erasing here. I do this all in, whoops. Okay, let me move two more sentences into position here. These are longer sentences, and they're slightly trickier. But the first step is to try rewriting them. And if I do so, I will notice that this one says if, oops, not if S, this would be if T, if Socrates brings tabbouleh and hummus, comma, then the philosophers will have a swell party, provided that, means if, there's plenty of wine and baklava. Got to have the baklava. All right, so if T and H, then P if W and B. Obviously, there's more structure in this sentence than what we see up here as our two basic patterns. But a good first step is always to put in some parentheses and find obvious groupings. We can see that T and H goes together and W and B goes together. Notice when we do this, we see that we have got two ifs and we've got three components. 1, 2, 3. So we are making this distinction. It's just that two of the parts have their own internal structure. All right. When we're in this situation, let's follow this, this little two-step process. Can we identify the are part of this sentence? Notice in this case, the answer to that question is being given to us immediately. The T and the H and the W and the B both have ifs in front of them. Therefore, the P has got to be the final consequent. I don't have a lot of space here, so maybe I'm just going to go ahead and write, do the work down here, and then I'll erase it. So P is going to be the final consequent. If you know what comes last, you typically don't need to change the order of the other parts. So T and H, arrow, W and B, arrow P. And I'm going to try it over here with the parentheses in the front. I'm going to try it on the back side, on the other side here, with the parentheses on the back side. W and B, arrow P, this time the parentheses over here. All right, now if I try to read this one, remember you want to try to read this first arrow as causes. And so this would say, if Socrates bringing tabbouleh and hummus causes there to be plenty of wine and baklava, then the philosophers will have a swell party. Notice that would be a very strange claim to make about the relationship between Socrates bringing tabbouleh and hummus and there being wine and baklava. One of them is not causing the other. So this seems implausible. Well, to read this one, we know that we want to translate it into the ampersand version. And so that would say T ampersand H, I'm getting kind of sloppy here, ampersand W and B, all of that, arrow P. Or in other words, if Socrates brings tabbouleh and hummus and there's plenty of wine and baklava, then the philosophers will have a swell party. Both of these is 100% correct. This trick that it's worth knowing about. Let's say that you wanted to seriously try both patterns when you have sentences like this and do what I'm suggesting. And so you read it this way with the arrow here and you say, wait, the causes one doesn't feel right. Well, notice what you could do is just cross off this arrow and then try it with an ampersand, because that's going straight to this version over here. I'm emphasizing the difference between this pattern and this pattern, but notice if you think about the relationship between this pattern and that pattern, the difference is just going from arrow to ampersand. So as a strategy for thinking about these two different patterns, that would be one way to work. Try it with an arrow. If you don't like the way the arrow sounds, try it with an ampersand. For the sake of completeness, we should point out a few more things. We know that it would be okay to switch the position of the W and the B and the T and H. You could write W and B, arrow, T and H, arrow P, and of course that would put the parentheses like that. Or of course, you could have the version with the ampersand. Last point, and let me see if I can do this making use of the delete key. Notice that these four inner parentheses are actually unnecessary. I could drop that parenthesis, that one, and also that one. And this would also be an acceptable symbolization because this is a string of ampersands here. The meaning of this sentence is really that if all four of these things are the case, then the philosophers will have a swell party. All right, well, lots of information there. Let's see if I can delete some things without deleting everything. That's always a challenge. Not too bad. And get rid of this. There we go. Now, last sentence. You should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche, supposing that studying philosophy leads to wisdom and happiness. And here's my pencil. Let's rewrite the sentence. If we do so, we would say P, notice this comma here is going to be an and, but I suppose I could just write comma there. P, K, and N. Supposing that, there was a comma, supposing that means if P leads to W and H. All right, P, K, and N, if P leads to W and H. Any obvious parentheses? Well, the W and H, really obvious. But then notice P, K, and N is also just a string of formulas connected by ampersands, P and K and N. Once we do this, you'll see that we have two synonyms for if and leads to, and we have three chunks, 1, 2, 3. So once again, we're making this distinction. Now we have to ask ourselves, which is the final consequent? Notice, I guess there's a couple of things to say about this sentence. One, leads to is kind of a tricky synonym for if. Notice I didn't just go ahead and cross out leads to and write if right here, because leads to is a synonym for the entire if-then, and the fact is it actually tends to sit in the position of the then, implying an if elsewhere. As a rule of thumb, just a general principle that allows you to cheat a bit, when you have leads to in sentences of these forms, it generally indicates this form right here. Notice the word causes is very similar to leads to, brings about, results in. And so we oftentimes use this phrase when we have this sentence in mind, when we have a sentence of this form in mind. In fact, when you look at this sentence, you might immediately recognize that the leads to, P leads to W and H, is going to go into parentheses. Sometimes these things are harder to talk about than they are to do. I worry sometimes that all this talking just adds complexity. Can you see what the R part of this sentence is going to be? You should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche, supposing that studying philosophy leads to wisdom and happiness. This is tricky, but it's the fact that you should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche. That is the R part of the sentence. P and K and N. Now, we put the other parts in the front. P arrow W ampersand H. Guess I gave that more space than I needed to. I'll make that a long arrow. Now, this is our, in comparison to the formulas up here, this is our P, Q, and R. And so I'll put the parentheses like that. I suppose I should mention that Plato and philosophy, they both begin with P's, which is less than ideal, but I hope that doesn't doesn't cause any problems here. P arrow W and H, arrow P and K and N. Reading that using this causal language, this would say, if studying philosophy leads to wisdom and happiness, then you should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche. If studying philosophy causes wisdom and happiness, then you should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche. I hope that it sounds like that makes really good sense. For the sake of comparison, let's write it the other way, which would be to say P arrow W and H arrow P and K and N, and that would put the parentheses around the back side, though we know the equivalent version would say P ampersand W and H, all of that in parentheses, and notice the parentheses around W and H become optional, P and K and N, and this would say if you're actually studying philosophy and you're actually wise and happy, then you should read Plato, Kant, and Nietzsche. That has a totally different meaning. Neither of these are correct. This is the version that we want. Notice there's nothing interesting that's logically equivalent to this formula. I hope this has been useful. Practice is what it's all about. Thanks.